Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War. On this episode of our Spanish Civil War interview series, I was joined by Dr. Karl Qualls to discuss his research into the Spanish child refugees that would make their way to the Soviet Union during the Spanish Civil War. These children would have unique experiences during their time within the Soviet Union, first expected to be only a few months, but which turned into years, and then for some, into decades. Many of them would never be able to openly return to Spain, and the Soviet Union would become their new home. As always, you can find out more information about Dr. Qualls' book, Stalin's Niños, on the website at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/interviews, where you can also find information about all the people who have joined us for the Spanish Civil War interview. Welcome to the Spanish Civil War interview series. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Karl Qualls, the author of Stalin's Niños, Educating Spanish Civil War Refugee Children in the Soviet Union, 1937 to 1951, which looks at the experiences of the almost 3,000 child refugees who made their way to the Soviet Union during the Spanish Civil War. Dr. Qualls, how's it going today?
Pretty well. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
For those of you who, of course, you do not know, we are recording this on Election Day in the United States, so it's quite an event for me, an American.
Definitely.
Okay, so when the children that would go to the Soviet Union were being ready to make the journey, how were they selected? Was there a specific set of criteria, or was it luck, basically?
It wasn't luck for most of them. There were a number of civic and governmental and political party organizations that did some of the pre-selecting. The Soviets were pretty upfront that they didn't want any children from the nationalist cause. They wanted children from the left. And that's essentially what they got. As you know, and your readers will probably know, the Spanish left is very fragmented. It's kind of an alphabet soup of political parties. And so the Soviets did get some children from political groups that they were not expecting, particularly anarchists. But most of them were one communist party or another, several socialist parties and things like that. But even then, the Basque Communist Party, which, this is probably the largest group of Niños, they were still Catholic, and that just didn't make sense to the Soviets. But they were being selected by these groups, and in some cases, some schools almost en masse were put on the ships and sent to the Soviet Union. So there was some coordination. It wasn't exactly without problem, but it wasn't complete happenstance either.
Okay. And you mentioned they were getting on ships. So the Soviet Union is a little far away from Spain.
Yes.
So how did they physically get to Russia? I'm assuming they were on some trains at some point?
So there's two different points of embarkation. So the first journey is in the 21st of March, 1937, just over 70 children. And these are from more privileged families, pilots, party members, and whatnot. And they go through the Mediterranean and the Black Sea and end up in the Crimean Peninsula in Yalta. The vast majority of the group, there's almost 3,000 in total that go to the Soviet Union. They end up in Leningrad, or today's St. Petersburg. And they leave from the north coast, so the Basque Country. And that's why we have so many Basque and Asturian children in the Soviet Union. Oftentimes, they will first port in France, and those ships are sometimes divided. Some of those will stay in France. Some go on to Southampton, England, and then others to Leningrad. And there's a couple of these more official journeys, one on the 12th of June, 1937, one the 24th of September, 1937, and then another year later in October 1938, we have the last 300.
Okay. And what was life like for these children in the Soviet Union? Were they growing up separately? Were they in group homes, or were they together?
Yeah, they actually have a very privileged life, and I think this is what really differentiates them from the other child refugees from the Spanish Civil War who go to different countries. Is the Soviet Union takes full responsibility for their upkeep. Unlike England, I know you've been doing some interviewing on that, where the government did not want them and did not give any aid to the children. The Soviet Union paid full fare. All their schooling, all their medical care, all their vacations, everything was fully paid by the government. The vast majority of them lived in 22 boarding schools that were created for them. The oldest children lived in boarding schools in the center of major cities like Kiev, Moscow, and Leningrad. Moscow and Leningrad having the most schools. The younger children live in the suburbs of those major cities, where there's lots of parks and rivers and forests to play in, and fresh air as well to breathe. Although they're boarding schools exclusively for the Spanish children, they're not isolated from Soviet children. In some cases, they're in the same school building as the Soviet children, so they would see them, certainly. And there are lots of events connecting the Spanish and the Soviet children. So as soon as they disembark in Leningrad, for example, the Young Pioneers, which is kind of like, for the American audience, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts combined, there's no gender difference there. They're there waiting for the children to walk down the gangplank, and are greeting them with hugs and kisses and songs and flowers and chocolates and those kind of things. They're meeting up in football or soccer tournaments. They're in resorts together for vacations. So they're not completely isolated, but they do, in their boarding schools, they're growing up as a unit. And actually they call it their family. And I think that really gives us a sense of how fond they were of these boarding schools. Some of them actually recall years later that when two former Niños married each other that were from the same house, they considered it to be an incestuous relationship because they're from the same, quote, family, because they grew up in the same boarding school. So they have really fond memories of this care and the largesse that the Soviet Union provides, food that they have never seen in quantities that they've never seen. And in fact, the budget for these homes was much higher than Soviet schools. So they really were a privileged group, even though, later when the war comes to the Soviet Union, life is tough. It's still not as tough as it was for Soviet children or Soviet adults.
So what would be the age range of the children that we're talking about here that made this journey?
The vast majority of them are between 5 and 14. They wanted them to be about 5 to 12 years old. Some kids snuck on the ships, or were snuck onto the ships a little bit younger or older. The idea is they don't want older adolescents. They want them to be able to go into these boarding schools and kind of learn in the way that the Soviets want them to. But they also didn't want tiny children, infants and toddlers, because these kids are coming without their parents. There are Spanish adults, as is the case in other countries they go to, who act as teachers and minders and things like that. No priests has happened in other countries. So they do have the adults, but they don't have parents. And so they didn't want the really young ones, and they didn't want the older ones who might be harder to train.
Okay. So you mentioned schooling. So I know that a big part of childhood in the Soviet Union was schooling. How were these children educated? Like, what was the philosophy guiding their education, and how did Soviet authorities try to balance their Spanish heritage with the fact that they were now living in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, and this was really the delicate balance, Leslie, because we have to remember also that the Spanish Communist Party is headquartered in Moscow at this point. And so there is this tension between them being Spanish and them being raised in the way that other Soviet children would. So the first couple of years, 1937 to 39, it's really one of just settling in and getting healthy. A lot of these kids are terribly malnourished. They have tuberculosis, avitaminosis, all kinds of things, and learning to study. And so this is both their language, and these kids are only being taught Castilian Spanish and not Basque. Also learning Russian, which they most of them, certainly the younger ones, pick up quite quickly. After that, 39, when the Civil War ends, not in their favor, because these are leftist children, children of the Republic, but also the Second World War begins, we see a shift in the education a little bit, in which more Spaniards are removed from the boarding schools and more of the staff is Soviet. And so this is kind of an inflection point that I see, in which the balance tilts from raising them as Spaniards in another country to raising them in what I call a Spano-Soviet hybrid model. So their education, they continue to learn Spanish language throughout their years in the boarding schools. They learn Spanish history very selectively. They learn Spanish geography, which is really important, and then Spanish literature. But the Spanish literature is very carefully selected. It needs to kind of represent the ethos that the Soviet Union is trying to get at. So dealing with things like camaraderie, heroes of the people, things like that. But then they also can't ignore people like Cervantes and Lope de Vega, right? They have this this need for the classics as well. So that's their Spanish education. That goes all the way through. Starting in 1939 or so, their education becomes more Sovietized. That is, they're learning the same curriculum that any Soviet child would. So there's a special group of schools in the Soviet Union that they call non-Russian schools. So this is schools for the children who are not native Russian speakers, right? It's a very polyglot country. And so in non-Russian schools, one learns everything in their host tongue, in their native tongue, and then learn Russian as a second language. So that's what's happening at the youngest levels. And then as we progress through what we would consider to be kind of middle or high school or upper school, more and more of the classes are being taught in Russian. But you'd be learning history, geography, politics, and the politics is obviously based around Marxism and the kind of international ethos that the Soviets are trying to teach. But otherwise, it looks like a pretty standard curriculum of reading and writing and arithmetic.
Excellent. So you mentioned that there's this shift as the war kind of gets to its end point. And I know that, speaking about other refugee children, there was a lot of government pressure to like get these kids back to Spain. Obviously, Franco wanted them to come back, but also governments wanted them kind of out of their countries. Was there similar pressure put on the Soviet Union to get them back to Spain as quickly as possible, especially given the much more antagonistic relationship between the Soviet Union and Franco?
Yeah, I mean, Franco calls them the stolen children, which isn't correct. I mean, the parents were making this decision because they feared for their life. Right? We have to remember that the major groups of children that are evacuated just after Guernica is bombed by the Nazis. So they fear for their life. They're living, just tens or a few hundred miles away from Guernica. So this was a choice that parents are making, a very painful choice. Much like the British case, they thought they would be there for a few months and then come back home. That wasn't the case. Franco definitely wants them to return. Both the Soviet government and the Spanish Communist Party leaders say that is simply not in their best interest. And a lot of that is because the way that they were being brought up in these boarding schools, so outside of classroom, right? They're learning the Marxism and things that wouldn't sit well with Francoists, but they're also learning what we call vaspitание in Russian. So this is kind of like the child rearing practices. So it's kind of disciplinary behaviors, and a lot of these would be frankly quite dangerous if they returned to Spain. So they're learning to be good atheists, for example, and they returning to a country that is, quasi ruled by the Catholic Church just would not sit well. They're learning that gender should not be a major category of discrimination. These young girls in particular, as they get older, they're being trained in medicine and engineering, where in Spain that simply wouldn't be possible. So the Spanish government, the nationalist government, definitely wants them to return, but it's nearly impossible for them to do so and be comfortable in that environment because they have learned a different perspective, one that's not hyper-nationalist, which Franco's new government was, but one that is internationalist, one that doesn't believe in the primacy of church, but believes in the primacy of class. And so their whole way of thinking and their way of behaving as well had been changed through these through the attention to how one thinks and relates to other human beings.
Were any number of them actually sent back after the Civil War was over, or were they all staying?
None were sent back against their will. We have none sent back immediately after the Civil War. So, for example, in Britain, almost all of them, right? And I think it's like 200, 300, something like that, don't return in 1939.
They shove them back real fast.
Real fast, absolutely. In the Soviet Union, it's the complete opposite. Okay. We have a very small number going back at the end of the Second World War. And I'm talking literally a handful or two handfuls. It's really in the mid-1950s that they start going back in large numbers. So about half of them return to Spain in the mid-1950s, but half of that half immediately returned to the Soviet Union because they realized that their whole worldview is the opposite of the Franco regime, and they're facing persecution, and their families are split up in a lot of cases because a lot of the Spaniards, as they grew up, they married with Soviet citizens. Many of them became citizens of themselves. Soviet men could not leave to Spain, but Soviet women could. So if it's a Spanish woman leaving for Spain, she has to leave her husband behind and maybe some children as well. And so it's breaking up families again, and the trauma they already suffered leaving their families, although almost all of them left with a sibling or a cousin or something like that, leaving behind the familiar for a second time and moving to a world that they have been taught for their entire school age and beyond was the antithesis of everything humanity could be, right? Because remember, it's the Soviet Union that is leading the fight against fascism. That's why the Soviet Union gets involved in the Spanish Civil War. They had been taught that the ruling government was the beginning of the Second World War, right? It was the rise of fascism, and the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War was the great break of history in which countries have to stand up to fascism. So going back to that fascist country was very uncomfortable. Some did it. Some made their way. There's one story. This man who goes back, and he'd been very well trained, even though he has a double amputee during the war in a train accident. He went back to Spain, having been trained as, I think, as a radiologist. And Franco was very ill at this point in the 70s. And guess who was doing the chest x-rays of Franco? Was this former Spanish refugee child. And he said, I couldn't tell him because I probably would have been arrested. And he actually snuck back into the country illegally. So there's a whole lot of reasons not to out himself.
And I guess like the younger half of the kids, by the time you get to the end of the Second World War, probably have only tiny or no memories of life in Spain.
Correct. Yeah. And so, one of the things, and I don't look at their lives in Spain all that much. I have a colleague who's working on that. I'm guessing that for those who left and stayed in Spain, those were probably the older children that came to the Soviet Union, right? Because they were raised outside of the boarding schools for most of their life. They're still Sovietized to a degree at the work site, but the youngest kids, is all they knew. So if they came in 1937 at 5 years old, by the end of the war, they're 13. Right, so the vast majority of their life has been spent in the Soviet Union. All of their education has been spent in the Soviet Union. That's what they know. That's home. And they often talk. They use this language in the oral histories and the memoirs of having two homelands, because they understand that they came from a different place. Right, they have this language that doesn't really fit in the Soviet Union, but yet all of their sensibilities, their ways of thinking and behaving truly are Soviet. And so it's really hard to look at this as one group, because if one was, say, 13 when she came to the Soviet Union, you have 1 year in school, right? School ends at age 14 for most children, except for the very highly academically adept students. So you might have 1 year, and then you're off to a factory to work somewhere. You don't get that acculturation in the same way that a 4-year-old would, who then spends 10 years in those institutions that are every day training you to view the world in a way that is very different, perhaps, than the way you were brought up. So I think there's some really interesting generational differences amongst this group, and it probably had a lot to do with the way they were able to adapt later, returning to Spain. Some then return also after Franco is dead, thinking that it's going to be more acceptable. And then another group after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses and the economy just goes in the toilet in the 90s, and eventually Spain says, okay, we'll actually give you a pension if you come back. And so there's a bunch of different waves, but the biggest one is in the middle of the 1950s.
So we have multiple different sort of time periods. But then, of course, in 1941, an event occurs and the Germans invade. So these were obviously very turbulent times for anybody living in the Soviet Union. So What sort of happened with these children during, those early war years when there was a lot of, I would call it chaos. I don't know if that's
Yes.
too strong of a word or
No,
not.
I think that's about right. Right. So these children, these boarding schools, were all in what we call the European Soviet Union, so west of the Ural Mountains. This means closest to the front lines as the Germans invade. So they, like all the factories and many of the children, Soviet children in that area, are evacuated. These are very long journeys, poorly planned journeys. And oftentimes their teachers, particularly male teachers, don't follow them because the male teachers are being called up or volunteering for the fight. So to give you an example, probably the longest journey would happen from Leningrad or St. Petersburg today to Samarkand, Uzbekistan, which is 2,600 miles by rail. That's about the same distance that they would have traveled to get to the Soviet Union by ship when they left in 1937. This journey sometimes took 20, 30 days because they would get to a city, think this is where they're supposed to stop, and the local officials would say, no, we don't have any place for you. You have to move on. There was no kind of set destination, so they kept being moved along further and further to the east. And they arrived in very inhospitable conditions for the most part. A very large group of them ends up in central Russia along the Volga River in a place called Saratov. And this is where a group that we call the Volga Germans, they had come at the end of the 18th century. Catherine the Great had brought them to basically be farmers in this new land. And they're German speakers. And so the Soviets were evacuating is not the right word, displacing them as potential collaborators with the Nazis. The Spaniards were supposed to move into their homes and their schools and stuff, but the Volga Germans had not left yet. And so the Spanish children arrive. The Volga Germans are not happy about giving up their property, apparently are throwing things at some of the children. But then some of the children also report that it wasn't so bad. But also that the KGB, or the predecessor to the KGB, was lying to them. So, for example, they were told, according to a couple of the Niños recollections, that they weren't supposed to eat any of the food that they found in Saratov. And remember, they're not traveling with food. So these kids are really, really hungry after a long journey. Because these Volga Germans have poisoned it because they're Germans, right? And these kids are so hungry, they're like, to heck with it, right? We're going to eat it because we have to. And they eat it and they don't get sick. And like, wait a minute, we've been lied to. And so for some of them, that was like a moment in their head. It's like, wait a minute, like this, at least part of this regime is not telling us the truth. But they're arriving in the fall, sometimes the early winter in these places. They don't have food. They don't have the heating fuel they needed. So the kids are learning or trying to learn in school, and their ink, right? That back in the day when we had ink wells, the ink is frozen. They don't have textbooks. They're bundled up in their coats and mittens and hats all day. A couple different kids tell exactly the same story in different recollections of finding a dead camel. Apparently it was a blind camel that couldn't find food in the snow, and they butchered the camel and ate it. Another kid apparently he was the bad boy in the group, because a lot of these stories are his, climbing down the chimney of a baker and stealing the flour and the oil and all those kind of things. I think it was also the same child who made a laying decoy. So it's a wooden, egg-shaped wooden thing that you put in a hen's coop to help her to lay more eggs. And he would take it to the local market and sell it as a real egg, trying to get some other kind of thing. And so they're scrounging, just trying to survive. And this is the first instance really where we see criminality amongst these children. Yeah, there's kind of minor hooliganism and things like that. The first seeing criminality, but it's really a criminality of survival because they're just so desperately hungry. And yet we look at the funding coming from Moscow to these schools, and it's so far higher than you would see in any regular Soviet orphanage or educational institution.
When the war is ongoing, I think doing the math here, some of these children are aging into military service. So
That's correct.
are they being brought into the Red Army, or are they fighting like any other, Soviet?
Yeah, many of these boys desperately want to fight, and they immediately go to the recruiting station because this is a fight against Franco for them. It's not just a fight against Hitler. This is a fight against Franco and fascism in their country. And this is what they've been preparing for these few years in the Soviet Union for. But they're not allowed to initially. The Spanish government, or excuse me, Spanish Communist Party, is really insistent that they need to continue their education or their job training. But these kids are relentless. And so several of them do end up joining in the Red Army and going off to fight. And some of them end up dying as well, including Dolores Ibarruri, the head of the Spanish Communist Party. Her son ends up dying on the front lines. I think is at the Battle of Stalingrad, actually. So yeah, several of them are joining, but even those who are either too young or not allowed or don't want to, just like every Soviet citizen, they're still joining the fight. So these kids are going out and foraging for medicinal plants. They are all growing their own food wherever they're located. The girls in particular are sewing things like socks and handkerchiefs for the soldiers at the front line. They're tending local graves, which is a thing. There's a movement called the Timur movement in the Soviet Union where youth tend the graves of the fallen. So they're doing all these things for the war effort, collecting scrap metal and paper that we see in a lot of other countries. But it's interesting because they're doing it not in their own country, for their own country, but for an ally of the country that they have lost.
When the war ends, so you mentioned that schooling kind of ends at about age 14.
Mm-hmm.
I think, by like 47, 48, 49, the last children would be reaching that age. So were there any government plans after that, right? Like was the Soviet Union, was the government like, okay, we're going to get them through school and then they just join society in a normal way?
Yeah, so that was, at least by 1939, when it was clear that they're not going back to a Republican Spain. At that point, they started training them to be Soviet citizens, or at least Soviet residents. And so that meant a lot more Russian language training. But it also began, during the war, a lot more, what we would call vocational training. So getting them prepared for the labor beyond. So Soviet education is from 7 to 14. And then if you're academically inclined, you'd have another 3 years. So grades 8 through 10. So there are two tracks, really. So there's those that immediately go into factory labor. And so they're krushki, these are kind of like study circles, after school activities. Some of them would already been preparing them for that. So they'd be working in a wood shop or metalworking, or for the girls, and this is where it is gendered in the Soviet case, they would be working in handicrafts and textiles and things like that. The second track would be those going on to higher education. And so they'd spend another 3 years in school and then go off to university or a technical school to become a engineer, doctor, nurse, something along those lines. There was a very brief experiment in 41, before the war started in the Soviet Union, of a transitionary stage between childhood and youth. So those who were 14 or had finished 7th grade, the last formal year that you had to attend, you went into another, what they call a youth home for Spanish kids. And so half the day you were supposed to be learning, so going to classes, and the other half you would be working in a nearby factory. And so you're learning a trade, but you're also continuing your education at the same time. Once the war started in June 41, those two schools for youth were disbanded. But it looks like from the reports of those schools, they didn't work really well anyway, because many of the kids who were there weren't academically inclined anyway. They just wanted to go to work and make money. And they used that money to buy cigarettes and alcohol and kind of all these things that both the communist parties of Spain and the Soviet Union, like, oh, what happened? We've gone so wrong. But these are the kids who weren't really Sovietized because they were already older when they had arrived or in the Soviet Union. So most of these kids, at 14, would go off to factories, and they realized that particularly the older ones didn't know enough Russian. They didn't know how a factory setting really worked in the Soviet Union. And so there was a government organization that came in to continue to help them out. And so this meant additional language training. It meant some additional skill training, but also meant providing stipends. These kids couldn't, like most Soviet adolescents, should stop saying kids at this point, they didn't have families. They didn't have, 2 and 3 generation families in an apartment that could pool their resources for food. So the Spanish youth began to get stipends of a couple hundred rubles, which is fairly significant, so they could buy food and not have to starve. And of course, they're eating in the cafeteria as well. And it's caused some problems. Some of the Soviet citizens are saying, well, why are these Spaniards getting access to additional funds that our Soviet children are not? Can't quantify how much of that pushback there is from the Soviet citizen, but many of their letters made it into the archives all the way in Moscow from some pretty far-flung areas. And so that notion that they had to continue with this disciplinary training, and I don't mean that in the sense of like hitting with a strap or something, but kind of how do you become Soviet? That continued even at the work site, and then eventually when they come back to Moscow. Certainly the younger ones come back to Moscow starting in 1944. And that continues. They built a club called the Chkalov Club that it's a place where they can meet and sing and speak in Spanish, to some degree eat, but also then can do outreach. And so they're performing Spanish plays for their Soviet friends and colleagues. So there's always an attempt to try to help the Spanish refugees to integrate better into Soviet society. But what I argue in my book is that it creates a culture of dependency that some of the Spaniards can't, or they struggle to break out of. So that culture of dependency of being in a boarding school, right, where your entire life is framed by the boarding school, that then continues in the factory. So you're now an adult, you're on your own, but in the same way, you're still being taken care of by the state and nurtured by the state. And I think that it probably delayed some of their abilities to actually adapt to Soviet society, because much of Soviet society is simply learning how to get by and learning how to survive on your own.
Okay. Thank you for talking to me today about this. This has been a very interesting conversation. And I think everybody will find it very interesting.
Thank you, Wesley. I really appreciate you asking me on here, and I can't wait to hear the podcast.